One note from Gene Watson could leave a room silent, his falsetto trembling like a farewell you weren't ready to hear. To fans, he was a legend. To fellow singers, he was the benchmark. Yet behind that voice was a story that few ever saw. A story not of fame, but of betrayal, collapse and heartbreak. For a time, Gene's songs filled radios. His records climbed the charts, and his name was spoken with the greats. Love in the Hot Afternoon, Paper Rosie, 14 Karat Mind. Each one carried him higher. But country music is a ruthless business. In one decade, he was celebrated as a savior of tradition. In the next, he was cast aside, trapped in lawsuits, battling illness, and mourning the kind of personal loss that could shatter any man. Still, Gene Watson refused to quit. His journey wasn't about chasing trends, it was about survival, loyalty to his sound, and a late triumph that proved true country music never dies. Gene Watson's career began without glamour. By day, he repaired cars in Houston. By night, he carried his guitar into smoky Texas honky-tonks. There were no managers, no labels, no promises of fame. What he had was grit, and a voice that cut through noise like a blade. In 1962, he made his first attempt to capture that voice on record with If It's That Easy. The single never charted, but it revealed something undeniable. Even on a tiny Sun Valley pressing, listeners could hear the ache in his phrasing. He wasn't chasing radio hits. He was singing as though every line carried his life inside it. For years, he lived a double life. Mechanic by day, singer by night. Many men in his position would have abandoned the dream. But every time he stepped onto a stage, whether it was a bar corner or a VFW hall, he felt the silence fall when he sang. That silence kept him going. The turning point came in 1975. He recorded Love in the Hot Afternoon, a sultry ballad about forbidden romance in New Orleans. The track was haunting, almost cinematic. Released independently, it spread like wildfire until Capitol Records picked it up. Within weeks, it reached number 3 on the Billboard Country chart. For the first time, Gene Watson's voice reached living rooms across America. Success followed quickly. Where Love Begins the same year showed his tenderness. In 1977, Paper Rosie told the story of a boy meeting an old woman selling flowers, only to learn at her funeral that she had died alone. The song was soaked in melancholy, and Watson's delivery made it unforgettable. By 1979, Nothing Sure Looked Good on You proved he could capture heartbreak in a single phrase. But nothing defined him more than Farewell Party. Released in 1979, the ballad about facing death should have been bleak. Instead, Watson's falsetto at the song's climax turned it into something transcendent. It became his signature, sung at funerals, tributes, and gatherings for decades to come. People didn't just listen to Farewell Party, they lived with it. For Watson, success wasn't proof of safety, it was only the beginning of a test. By the early 1980s, Gene Watson was at his peak. In 1981, he scored his first #1 with 14 Karat Mind. The clever wordplay about love traded for wealth struck listeners, but it was Watson's delivery, resigned, wounded, that made it timeless. The decade produced a string of hits. Speak Softly, You're Talking to My Heart, Got No Reason Now for Going Home, Sometimes I Get Lucky and Forget. Each release reinforced his identity as the singer's singer. Fellow artists admired how he could move from baritone to falsetto without strain, while others leaned on flash. Watson's restraint became his power. What set him apart was his refusal to compromise. Nashville in the 80s was moving toward a shinier crossover sound. Artists like Kenny Rogers and later Randy Travis were drawing pop audiences. But Watson held to fiddles, steel guitars, and sorrowful ballads. He believed country music should tell the truth about love, loss, and regret. Fans responded. They saw themselves in his songs. They heard their own heartbreak in his phrasing. He was not the loudest star on stage, but he was the one who could make an entire room fall quiet. Yet beneath the triumph, storms were gathering. Nashville's loyalty to tradition was fading. Radio was beginning to turn its back. And behind the scenes, Gene Watson would face betrayal that threatened not just his career, but his very survival. At the height of his career, Gene Watson wasn't just topping charts, he was being studied. Nashville is full of singers chasing recognition, but among his peers, Watson was already something rarer, a singer's singer. The phrase followed him through the late 1970s and into the 80s, not as a marketing line but as a truth passed from artist to artist. Merle Haggard once pointed to Watson's phrasing as an example of how a ballad should be delivered. George Jones admired his ability to wring emotion from the simplest lyric. Conway Twitty, whose own career was built on blending tenderness with strength, acknowledged Watson's control as unmatched. These weren't casual compliments. They came from men who knew what it meant to stand on a stage and hold a crowd. What made Watson so respected was his precision. He could hold a note until it trembled without breaking. He could rise from the depths of a baritone to a falsetto that sounded like it might shatter but never did. And unlike singers who reached for applause through vocal tricks, Watson used restraint. He gave just enough, leaving audiences suspended in silence, waiting for more. Fans recognized it too. Those who saw him in Texas dance halls or later on national tours often spoke of the hush that fell when he sang Farewell Party. Entire rooms stopped breathing for the length of a note. People left convinced the song had been sung to them alone. This reputation as a singer's singer mattered because it elevated Watson beyond the charts. Hits fade, and radio moves on. But when fellow artists call you the standard, that legacy endures. By the end of the 1980s, his place among the great voices of country music seemed secure, which is why the betrayal and collapse that followed were so shocking. To be admired by legends is one thing. To be cast aside by the industry that raised you is another. And Gene Watson would soon face both. By the late 1980s, Gene Watson should have been secure. He had hits, respect, and a legacy already forming. But his greatest threat came not from audiences or rivals. It came from his own management. He signed with Lib Hatcher, a powerful Nashville figure who promised to elevate his career with television spots, major tours, and connections alongside rising stars. But those promises never came. When Watson tried to break free, Hatcher sued him. The legal fight was devastating. Locked in litigation, he was barred from signing with new managers or labels. Warner Brothers had just released his album At Last in 1991. But once the lawsuit surfaced, they dropped him immediately. Overnight, his career was paralyzed. Financial ruin followed. Money drained into legal fees. Bookings dried up. Friends in the business stopped calling. One day he was headlining theaters. The next he was wondering how to keep his house. And then came another blow. Country music itself was shifting. Garth Brooks filled stadiums with fire and spectacle. Shania Twain and Faith Hill brought pop gloss to the charts. Radio no longer wanted the kind of aching ballads Watson specialized in. What had once made him indispensable now branded him outdated. It was a double betrayal. Management had drained him, but the industry itself had abandoned him. For a man who had built his life on resilience, the collapse was more than professional. It was personal heartbreak. The voice that had once been called the purest in country music was now ignored, silenced not by lack of talent, but by the machinery of Nashville. Yet Gene Watson had faced hardship before. He knew survival. But this battle would demand more strength than any stage had ever required. After the collapse, Watson stood at a crossroads. Many singers would have walked away, content to live off old hits. But for Watson, quitting was never an option. He found a lifeline in Canadian producer Gary Buck. Together they recorded In Other Words in 1992. The single One and One and One charted briefly at number 66, but without radio support it faded. Soon after, Buck died, leaving Watson without an anchor once again. He turned to Jack McFadden, who had managed Merle Haggard. McFadden believed in him, but his attention was split. He was also guiding Billy Ray Cyrus, whose achy breaky heart was dominating airwaves. Watson had the voice, but not the machine. The 1990s became a grind of small venues, county fairs, and festivals. He recorded albums for Step One Records, Uncharted Minds, Jesus Is All I Need. The songs were as pure as anything he had ever done. But Nashville didn't care. Radio programmers had already moved on. For Watson, these shows were not humiliation. They were survival. Each night he stood before smaller crowds. He proved something, that his voice still mattered. Fans wept in those rooms, just as they had in arenas. The scale had changed. The sincerity had not. Yet behind his resilience was heartbreak. Award shows ignored him. Radio erased him. Labels chased youth. The tradition he embodied was being buried. But Watson clung to one truth. His sound was not outdated. It was eternal. Then came the cruelest test. In the year 2000, doctors diagnosed Gene Watson with colon cancer. Surgery and chemotherapy followed. The treatments were brutal. For months, he could not tour. He didn't know if he would ever stand on a stage again. By March 2001, he emerged cancer-free. But relief was short. That same year, his daughter Terry died at only 58. For Watson, it was the deepest loss of his life. He rarely spoke of it, but fans felt it in his music. Every song afterward carried the weight of grief. Even in sorrow, recognition began to return. In 1998, peers gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award. In 1999, 18 Greatest Hits reintroduced his classics to a new generation. In 2000, the Golden Voice Award honored him as one of the finest vocalists in the genre. The honors did not restore chart dominance, but they offered validation. For decades he had carried the torch in obscurity. Now the industry slowly admitted what fans had always known. Gene Watson's voice was timeless. The crowning moment came in January 2020. Gene Watson walked onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry and was formally inducted. It was the dream of his life delayed, but never denied. He was no longer the singer in shadows. He was where he belonged, among the legends. Behind the voice and the records, Gene Watson built something even more enduring. A marriage that lasted more than 60 years. In January of 1961, at only 17 years old, he married Mattie Louise Bivens. She was just 15 at the time. And from that day forward, she became not only his partner in life, but also his anchor through every storm the industry threw at him. While Watson stood under stage lights, Mattie often stayed in the background. She managed parts of his touring, helped with business decisions, and even lent her voice to background harmonies on recordings. When lawsuits drained him, she held the home together. When cancer nearly ended him, she sat through every treatment. Watson has often said that without her, his career might not have survived. Their family included 2 children, a daughter named Terry Lynn and a son named Gary Wayne. Losing Terry in 2001 was a wound that never fully healed. But through it all, Mattie remained by his side. In a world where fame often destroys relationships, their quiet devotion gave Watson a strength that charts and awards never could. Away from the spotlight, Watson was not the tragic figure some might imagine. He found peace in simple things, tending a garden, fishing by the water, or reading books that offered reflection rather than escape. These hobbies painted a portrait of a man who could separate himself from the noise of Nashville, a man who found balance in nature and family. For fans, this part of his story matters as much as the hits. They see not only a country singer but a husband and father who endured everything with dignity. The music industry may have overlooked him at times, but in his home and in the hearts of his fans, Gene Watson never stopped being valued. His legacy isn't only measured in albums and awards. It is also measured in loyalty, in family, and in the quiet truth of a marriage that outlasted fame itself. Gene Watson's story is not just one of songs and charts. It is the story of resilience in the face of betrayal, illness, and devastating personal loss. He could have quit after the lawsuit. He could have quit after cancer. He could have quit after burying his daughter. But he chose to sing. Across 34 albums, 72 charted songs, and 23 top 10s, Watson proved greatness isn't measured only by airplay. It is measured by endurance, sincerity, and the power to make a listener stop and feel. His falsetto on Farewell Party still echoes as one of the most haunting moments in country music. His voice remains as pure today as it was when he first stepped into a studio. At 81, Gene Watson still performs. Each stage he walks onto carries the weight of his journey, the rise, the collapse, the shadows, and the recognition. His music proves that true country isn't about trends, it's about truth. And Gene Watson has lived that truth, note by note, word by word, decade after decade. For more emotional stories, check out this video.